Well, there it was again, going over a mission report for the next jump when they start warming up the machine. Now, I do have to mention, it doesn't make much the same sounds as you hear in those science fiction shows. On those, you can usually hear the sound of a turbine starting up. Now, the original machines, they did have a turbine engine attached. However, they haven't used those in several decades now. In fact, the startup noise is very similar to a computer starting up without the fan on it. I guess due to how few moving parts there are, that's all I can guess. Though not loud at all, it sounds almost comforting, really. Only due to the fact that if the rhythm is steady and solid, then all the systems are just working correctly, and let's just say, for a jumper, that's just nice. As I began to walk up to the machine, alarms started going off. This was an emergency recovery alarm. If it goes off, you only got a few seconds for the machine to warm up and enough for the recovery to happen. Once that happens, you better be out of the way because you don't have any idea what could be coming through. If you're in the room when that happens, you have to treat the situation like somebody just yelled, "Grenade!" You dive for the side, cover your head. The car that came through, that I had mentioned before, had actually hit one of the engineers, almost severing a limb and catching fire after impact. So I didn't take any chances as I dove off to the side. To my surprise, only one person came out, and it was one of ours. He came running through the field completely exhausted. He looked like he had just run through an artillery barrage. Clothes were tore up and in some spots still smoking. He had multiple puncture wounds and lacerations, but no arterial bleeds. I ran over and pulled my IFAC, pronounced IFAC, first individual first aid kit, out from under my pant leg and began to assess and treat the casualty. I had barely started when the medics came in. One pushed me out of the way pretty hard and began to perform his own assessments. I was yelling that he had possible second-degree burns where the worst of the bleeding was, and that he was, I don't know, possibly concussed. I didn't have too much of a chance to look at him, but they didn't seem to care. But they did attend to him with extreme precision. As they got him on the gurney, they were beginning to take him away when the active retrieval team came in and started picking up the recording devices left behind. I tried to get their attention, but they didn't seem to even hear me. That is, until I grabbed one by the arm and physically stopped him. "Hey, I need to know something." He just turned with a look that said, "Let go or you're dead." I continued with, "Does this alter my mission statement?" They looked at each other for a second, clearly not knowing, and then pulled out the radio. They called, and I could hear the response. "Negative. He is to continue as scheduled." They turned to me, and I simply turned away and began to pack up the rest of my IFAC. While doing so, one of the engineers walked over and showed some concern for the first time since my arrival. He handed me his own IFAC and said, "Here, take this one." I thanked him, and he took mine. I strapped the new one on and proceeded with my jump. Now, I have to say that everyone working around the machine has a plethora of gear hidden out in plain sight. Most, if not all, kept some kind of medical equipment and protection on them. Everyone has at least one multi-tool on their belt. You would be amazed how many times they need to use it. So someone having a spare equipment on their person and swapping out to meet the timeline is fairly common. My next jump was another 7-year jump. In fact, the next few were, and some basically same timeline jumps. This made it mostly uneventful, though. I began to see what made people so confused doing this job. Even though it was only 7 years time since moves between jumps, if you are not jumping, then time moves normally, regardless of what you do. So if you come jump to a location in January, my time, and jump to the same location in June, my time, then you do not jump back at the same time you left unless they program the machine to do so. That, however, takes way more calculations and a lot more power. So I would end up jumping to the same location, but 6 months has passed there as well compared to when the last time I jumped here. Each time I began to notice subtle changes. For most of them, it was small things like a change in curtains or an adjustment in animals, though every once in a while you would have something big. Like when I jumped for the first time, my contact's dog barked like crazy, but took a liking to me. It brought tears each time, but on one occasion I whistled for it and received no response. Turns out something had changed and he never bought the dog, or the dog had gotten hit by a car in one time. Yes, I did feel sympathy for the dog and the contact, though it was short lived. On my very next jump, the dog came running right up to me. That was the first real taste of what distance jumpers were going through, each and every time. At that point, I could see why they wanted the new personnel to only take short jumps. For at least 3 months, this went on, and even though I wasn't supposed to watch the news broadcasts I was recording, I could still get information from conversing with my contact. What I found out never went on the report. In that time, the solar maximum had begun to show its true colors. Strap in tight because this is going to be a long ride. First, let me explain the solar maximum. As Nikola Tesla puts it, if you want to find the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and, of course, waves or vibration. Depends on which way you want to look at that. Well, the sun is no different. Think of looking at wavelengths of energy. Now, realize that the sun goes through maximums and minimums in the same way. During a maximum, there is far more energy hitting the north and south poles. When this happens, the weather patterns are a bit unstable. You want a minimum, usually, because when that happens, they're so stable, in fact, that you can almost set your watch to when each season begins and ends. During a solar maximum, however, weather becomes erratic and major crop losses happen due to sudden changes in the inclement weather. Now, many people who already know about this are trying to use it for political and financial gain, and they are very, very good at it. I figured my employer was in on this too, but then I realized they were only trading in information. And this information was much more than people realize. I will say this. After listening to a few other long distance jumpers, I found out that eventually the world does figure this out. It will just take a little longer time before the useful idiots quiet down enough for the truth to come out. Like I said before, people want to manipulate the system for their own gains, and they're very good at it. As far as the USA is concerned, food prices are high, but they're getting by okay. So much of the political posturing, even my contact doesn't want to even talk about it. Certain foods became incredibly expensive, though. I didn't know the coffee we were drinking was about $25 a cup in some places, mainly due to other countries putting tariffs on it so they could get enough money to keep themselves going. Many cartels have sprouted up around this single product that everybody has. Makes you wonder about that whole thing in the 80s about heroin was the morning cup of coffee. But I digress. But items like chocolate, coconuts, banana, rice, and even some consumer goods like wool, cotton have gone up significantly. At least we're doing better than the rest of the world. Russia has unsurprisingly kept things together through, well, let's just say violence, though the reports of violence leak out every day. It is not the revolutionary type of violence, just the stealing someone's food and getting shot type. Putin was still in power, and that man is many things, but stupid, well, I thought stupid was not one of them. Unlike his socialist predecessors, he did not have the kill off half the population to keep the other half alive mentality. Though there are work camps for those that can't afford to purchase food. I got no pictures or videos of this, but they can't all be great, I'll tell you. China is on the absolute brink. And what I mean that is the brink of everything. Turns out while I jumped, they were trying to force the neighboring countries to hand over their commodities, though they won't call it an invasion of Chinese forces taking over places like Vietnam, Laos, Mongolia, and they even down into Thailand, claiming they're trying to stabilize the region. It's a complete farce, and everyone knows it. The only reason they haven't gone after Japan or South Korea is due to the fact there's always a U.S. carrier group just outside the waters and right in the vicinity close enough where they can strike back. Saying tensions are high is being very mild. However, they got a taste for what would happen if they try to keep this up. When they claimed that they were going to take North Korea and place it under protection, well, one of the PRC army they had to fight on their hands. Though both armies are dealing with starvation rationing, they took a big piece out of each other. I think it took a page from the old European history books, or the Socialist Handbook, I should say. That by over 300,000 dead is a lot less people to actually feed, meaning more food to go around. As I sat and listened to this, I just had my mouth open in disbelief that something like this would happen so suddenly. We were talking only 7 years at this point. I think my contact could read the shock on my face because he took a long drink and said, "Don't worry, it gets much worse." I really hate that he was right. India and Pakistan were already at each other's throats before this even began, and now they're in full blown border war. Now, I don't drink, but hearing this, I reached over and poured myself a shot. Two nuclear powers going to war and each other, and oh, come on, this can't end well, was all I was thinking. Then, as he pulled out a map, I began to lay everything out. Now, because of the topography in that area, heavy equipment can't move easy. This was going to be a very up close and personal for both sides. That was really hurting them in their instance of tradition in combat. Seriously, if your headgear can be seen for like a kilometer away, you need to rethink of what you're wearing. The casualties expected would be over 5 million if this really kicked off, and that's a large number. But if it comes down to nukes, then that number's fairly low. And this wasn't even the worst area of the world. The Middle East began to rip itself apart. It was like the 1967 war all over again. This time, the Israelis weren't giving any land back. Though not protected directly by the U.S. military, there was a battle group in the Mediterranean Sea covering the ocean side from the assault. A lot of equipment was sent to help them out, and this time they began to expand in all directions. However, there was a problem. This being that as soon as they prepared to assault a major city, the city leaders would surrender, and then you have a population center to protect and supply. The logistic issues on this alone are insane. Right about the time he said that, "Now let's talk about Europe," my alarm went off, and I had to go. I thanked him again for his hospitality and simply asked how he was doing through all this. He responded with, "I'm getting by." I took that as a subtle hint and didn't push the matter. I collected all my gear and headed out to the open area so I could make my jump. On the way out, I handed the dog his last treat and I had to walk away. I hit the retrieval beacon and stumbled a little as I came back and my feet dragged a little on the floor. The archive retrieval team was already there and I handed them all my gear and started heading to the door. I then remembered something. I turned to the engineer from before, walked over to him, and started to take off my IFAC to give it back to him. He saw me doing this, and he just raised his hand and said, "Keep it." I gave him a nod and headed to the debriefing room. My report was sparse due to the fact that I didn't want to get my contact in trouble, and I needed to think about a few things. I simply put down how we talked about his family, weather, how the farm was doing, all the small talk shit. Didn't talk to anyone really for a few days. I was just trying to wrap my brain around how things were going to get so bad. I knew my family would be okay since we grew up subsistence living. That means, growing and raising what you need to survive. Though the more I thought about my employer and their clients, I realized that things would be different the next time I jumped. And the next time I jumped wasn't for almost 2 weeks. This was very strange at first to find that all my missions were suspended until further notice. At first, I thought I did something to get me in trouble, but everyone had been put on hold. I asked around to find out that the jumper that had almost hit me on the way through and that I treated has something wrong with them. Not mentally wrong, but they would need some new equipment before he jumped again. I also found out that he had jumped over 200 years. This is relevant due to the fact that most of us only jump to a century. Jumping 200 can be extremely dangerous due to several hundred factors. Things like natural disasters in the area, tectonic shifts, temperament of locals, and things like that. What this had to do with my mission was still a mystery, though I took some time off to visit my family and take care of some time for myself, of course. Turns out that if you can't talk about your job or have vacation photos to show, then visiting family is just a test of patience. Having to help out with young kids, helping them fix items around the house, and my favorite, helping them move heavy items because I'm family and I'm visiting. After that, I decided to take a trip overseas. Now, this was twofold. First is that I had always wanted to visit certain areas like Jerusalem and Moscow. Second, I wasn't sure if I was ever going to get the chance again, though will say I spent a couple days in Bangkok and Vegas. All in all, it was very nice of a vacation, and I was ready to get back to work. As I got ready for my mission, I was surprisingly anxious to get going. I was so interested to hear how things changed, how they were able to stop all the carnage from enveloping the entire world. I did find it interesting challenge to figure the situation out to see what might change. Once I jumped, I walked up to the house. I was surprised that there were no major changes to the property. The dog ran up and immediately started begging me for a treat. He immediately would sit if he wanted one, and I was not going to disappoint. In fact, I had bought the biggest one I could find. I knocked on the door, and my contact opened up with a grin. My heart suddenly sank when he said, "Welcome back." I tried to keep the grin off my face, but I already knew what that meant. You see, if someone changes the present, then the future will change with it. This means that whatever you did in the previous time will be overwritten. So let's just say that you're in a car accident and someone pulls you out of the car. Well, that's one future. Once somebody changes the present, that they could simply have a bus get in front of you and slow you down so you don't get in the accident. Now, not only is your life different, but so is the experience of everyone you changed that day. From the ones that stopped to help you to the ones that made you late for work because you forced traffic to stop. So, since timeline hadn't changed and everything had gone to shit, truth be told, I should have figured this out when the dog came up to me. I actually dreaded hearing what the rest of the world was doing thanks to the solar maximum. It is so much worse. Most of East Africa was starving while West Africa couldn't keep up with the sickness coming in. Since they still had a problem with Ebola, the lower food intake was causing more and more people to get sick easier. Some governments even created death squads that would end an entire village if they had a single outbreak. Southern Africa was actually doing a lot better compared to the rest. They looked a lot like Russia at this point. In fact, so did South America, though you did have countries shutting their borders entirely due to the insane amount of refugees from places like Venezuela. And they thought they had food issues before. Mexico became a country in name only. The cartels used food as a weapon to pacify the population and to kill others, namely politicians that got in their way. Though the regular citizens had not quite given up. Think ninja versus samurai, and you kind of get the rough idea. Our northern neighbor was doing better than people would think. Granted, there's far more poaching than there should be, but they're getting by. Their biggest problem was with costs going up so high, the people in cities had decided to do what they want to either starve or freeze to death. The last few winters had been really rough too. Though they are tough people, they did have to improvise a lot to get by. It was difficult to listen to, but I knew I had to. You see, I decided that I would do what I had to in order to secure my family, so this was recon for me as well. After I returned, I decided that I should not sit and wait. I took whatever time I had to begin to get my property ready. Yes, I do have property, and no, I'm not going to tell you where it is. I cleared off areas that couldn't be seen from the road and began to set up greenhouses that could handle the weather changes. Cleared the old pastures out and got them seeded, cleaned out the barns and made plans to purchase some new equipment. Then it was on to the house. Oh boy, getting that ready and fully stocked is going to take some time. Time I was not sure I was going to have. Though I had the money, the time available was not easy to come by, especially what happened about 3 weeks later. I showed up to pick up my mission briefing and was shocked to find out that I was not going to go 7 years in the future anymore. In fact, I was going 70 years into the future, 7-0. I thought this was a joke and ran into El Doctor on the way to the main office to see if I was reading this right. I was walking fast and with a purpose when he simply yelled out, "Congratulations on the promotion!" I stopped dead in my tracks. What? He looked confused at me and said, "Didn't they tell you? You've been promoted to level 4 yesterday." Stunned in response, "They didn't tell me anything," lifting the folder. "I thought this was a typo or something." He just gave me that grin of his and motioned like he had to leave. "Look, I can give you the details when you go out for drinks later to celebrate," he said as he yelled. "You know, I don't drink," I yelled back at him, but he didn't even turn as he yelled, "You will when I'm buying." I can't argue when people say that. Just so you know, the levels are as follows. Level 1 are entry personnel, literally. Those are receptionists and perimeter security guards. Level 2 are general maintenance personnel inside a facility, like janitors, repair crews, internal security personnel, that sort of thing. Level 3, you're starting jumpers. Those will only jump within the 10-year window. You have such a high turnover rate that they get very, very limited information. Level 4, you're on the base level of the engineers for the time dilation equipment, and the next level of jumpers. From then on, jumpers and engineers can keep going up the levels until they hit level 9. Only engineers can reach level 10, along with administrative personnel. Administrators have one level higher, and it does not get any higher than level 11. You get that high, most have been in this business for over a decade and are fully responsible for anything that goes wrong. Now that I'm level 4, I have access to more information before a mission, and I have limited access to the archives, though I do have to submit a request with a strong enough reason for my inquiry. Someone would have to be level 8 or better to get full access, and I have a suspicion that level 11s are the only ones that truly get full access. I didn't waste this and looked up all the information I could about my next jump. Shockingly, it wasn't much to get since I was brand new level 4. Since I was looking forward to my next jump, even though I had to bring far more items with me, I still almost skipped on my way to the machine as I heard that low level hum as it warmed up. As soon as I jumped, I knew something was off. The farm I usually jumped to was extremely run down, and the fields had not been attended to in at least a decade. The house and barn were in clear disrepair, with vines growing up the sides and a few windows broken out. The barn was just sitting with the doors closed, still standing tall and red like a big zit in the middle of the field. I noticed that was my landing was fairly far off from where I usually end up. In fact, the dilation bubble had knocked down a couple of trees on my way in. This made me remember my training about widowmakers falling down on a few jumpers. Thankfully, nothing had come my way, but I took a mental note of it. It took far longer to reach the house, where I opened the door and began to walk around. The power didn't work, but there were several still hurricane lanterns around. I thankfully had some fuel left. In my gear, I had a lighter, so I was able to get a few rooms illuminated and begin setting up my electronics. Once everything was in place, I powered everything up and tried to get a signal. I watched the screen sit there and blink, searching for signal, for several minutes. It didn't take long for me to realize that there was just no signal to work with, at least not one that I was going to be able to tap into. I let it search for about a half an hour before I shut everything down. I narrated to the camera as everything was powering down. Well, better try again in the morning. The strange thing is that I had jumped at noon, and when I arrived, it was dusk. I know there was always variables when jumping, so I was hoping this was just the only one I had to deal with. Though this variable was easy to deal with since I had brought some liquid sleep with me. I was able to find a bed and wasn't damaged or too dirty to sleep in, I guess. Before bedding down, I remembered that my contact always had a hidden compartment where he kept his emergency supplies. This was behind a false wall in the basement along with one on the third floor. When I went to see if there was anything I could use, I began to get a little worried when I saw that both were empty. Not just a few items were gone, but everything had been removed. The false walls had not been damaged or tampered with, so someone had to know that they were there to take the items. In fact, there was nothing left of real value in the house. I decided to forget about it for now and just get some sleep. Before I did, I took out a few items, a rad meter, a chemical tester, a motion detector, and set them up so that I wouldn't be waking up to a truly bad situation. Though it was a quiet night, the feeling that I was going to be stepped into something dangerous the next day concerned me. The next morning, I ate breakfast, packed up my items, and moved out. It was a long walk to town, and everything was eerily quiet. The animals were still making noise, so at least I knew I wasn't a cross species pandemic and that this town was so quiet. As I walked through the center of town, it was clear that the town had been abandoned a while ago. The plants had already started to take back the town. Even a few trees had begun growing through the sidewalk. It took a while, but I finally found the old repeater tower that I could hook up to. I was able to receive a signal, but it wasn't much. I began to look through the little bits, but decided to come back to it since the download speed was so low. Headline: Evacuations begin as fallout heads to the west coast. Apparently, the solar maximum had made food so scarce that multiple countries had gone to war in the east. Pakistan, India, China, and Russia all fighting for resources. Eventually, it got so bad that there was another nuclear exchange. This time, very dirty weapons were used, and the resulting fallout had caused a chain reaction. Due to this, a large amount of radiation had climbed in the atmosphere and was drifting across the Pacific. As soon as I read this, I checked my rad meter again. It still read 0. I wasn't going to stick around for long. I knew my retrieval wasn't for a few hours, but I put serious thought into using the emergency retrieval. As it got close to my retrieval time, I grabbed the equipment and put everything away. I didn't even look to see how much information is gathered. I didn't care. I shoved it all into my bags along with that newspaper. I was on my way out of the town when I noticed something in the woods moving around. At first, I thought it might be a deer, but on second glance, it moved more human, just not fully human. I didn't pay it much mind until I was a little more than halfway back to the farm. I could hear more movement in the trees as I walked. It got to the point where I drew my sidearm, just out of being careful. Just doing that seemed to quiet them down, though, just a little bit. I looked at my watch and saw that it was nearly the retrieval time. Close enough, in fact, that I could jump without causing too much trouble. I looked up and something felt off. I turned around and there was something, and I mean multiple somethings on the road behind me. They looked mostly human, but there was something just off about them. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I wasn't going to stick around and find out. I yelled at them to back off, and I kept moving away, constantly checking around me to make sure I didn't get flanked. They kept pace with me, but kept their distance, but kept inching closer as time went on. Eventually, my watch went off telling me that it was time to jump. I don't know if they knew what was going to happen or the alarm just set them off, but they just charged. I unloaded the entire magazine into the closest one. It barely even flinched, and I could hear a few bullets seemingly bounce off. I reloaded and hit my retrieval beacon. In a few seconds it took for the machine to spin up. I emptied the next magazine. This time it dropped, but the others kept coming. I loaded my last magazine and began to fire point blank at whatever was there. One of the bullets went clean through one of the heads, and it fell, and the others were almost on top of me. That's when the jump happened. One thing to note is that the further you are from the jumping point, the more violent the jump tends to be. This can be enough to throw you across the room or at least make you vomit as soon as you enter the room. The former happened to me, and I was tossed out of the machine about 10 feet and slid across the ground, still holding my pistol to the gate just in case. As the field stopped and the machine powered down, the retrieval team walked up, and I yelled, "Decon! Decon!" as loud as I could. This told everyone that there may be contaminants on my clothes or person. I ran into the decom chamber, throwing the bags into the bin just inside the chamber door, stripped down and sprayed in there all over me and stayed in longer than I had to. When I finally came out, I was informed that they didn't find any type of contaminants, biological or otherwise, on my gear or clothes. I still asked them for a few new sets of clothes and to dunk my pistol into the solvent tank. I know this isn't good for the plastic, but I didn't give a shit. After debriefing, I took up El Doctor on that drink he wanted to do, and I had one hell of a story for him. They gave me an extra few days off to compose myself and to see it shrink before my next jump. Some might quit after something like that, but I'm a bit stubborn. Besides, I wanted to see what changed from my last jump anyway. Although, this time I was bringing some armor piercing incendiary bullets, just in case.